Meanwhile, President Joe Biden says evidence shows that a stray missile that crashed into Poland on Wednesday was likely fired by Ukraine's air defenses. Zelensky insisting the missile was launched by Russian forces. Take a listen to Zelensky and the response from Russia's ambassador speaking at a UN Security Council meeting on Wednesday.
Surely, one of the main questions at the Security Council meeting is the situation in Poland, the clarification of all the circumstances of how Russian aggression crossed the Polish border. The Ukrainian position is very transparent. We strive to establish all the details, every fact. That is why we need our specialists to join operations of the international investigation and to get access to all the data available to our partners and to the site of the explosion. All our information is in full access. We have been giving it to our partners since the night, since those first hours, when the world began to investigate what had happened.
We have long ago stopped being surprised by your attempts in any circumstances, in spite of facts or common sense, to blame Russia for everything. And so today, in spite of clear evidence of the Ukrainian-Polish provocation, many representatives of Western countries have stated to the effect that even if the missiles were launched by Ukraine, it's still Russia who is to blame for destroying critical infrastructure.
We have complete confidence in the Polish government's investigation and appreciate the calm, careful, and measured response. While we still don't know all the facts, we do know one thing. This tragedy would never have happened but for Russia's needless invasion of Ukraine and its recent missile assaults against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The UN Charter is clear. Ukraine has every right to defend itself against this barrage.
And joining me in studio is our senior international affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman. Owen, always a pleasure. Owen, I want to ask you, NATO countries and Poland are insisting that Ukraine air defense systems are behind this strike, as Zelensky is claiming otherwise. How do you interpret this complete disagreement?
It's a bit of a question mark about what Zelensky is trying to achieve, Sarah. One would imagine that the investigation that the Poles and the allies have carried out is going to be accurate. They obviously have an incentive to do it. I guess one could argue that were this to have been a Russian missile, they might have an incentive to say otherwise, which would allow them to escape the hard decision about what to do in response. That said, I would imagine that there would be independent ways to verify what the facts are from outside the governments. And so one would imagine that they would have an incentive to be truthful here and to be accurate. So it's hard to understand exactly what Zelensky is doing, especially because this hasn't hurt Ukraine's good name. It hasn't done anything to dent any of these countries' support for Ukraine. We just heard it at the UN.
It's quite surprising, don't you think?
In a way, you're right. But on the other hand, everyone understands the big picture of the war.
Right.
Everyone understands the big picture of where their interests stand. And this doesn't change that. Obviously, it's a horrible tragedy for the people who are affected. It shows the capacity of this war to cross borders and to affect countries that are neighbors of Ukraine. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the big picture of the war and who's fighting and why and what the interests are of the countries. And the fact that there is a general recognition of that should actually encourage the Ukrainians. And it seems to me that Zelensky would be much better off pivoting to his strength, which is not talking about what it is that may have happened in Poland, but what's happening in Ukraine. And what the Russian military is doing in Ukraine. Reports just this morning, Sarah, of renewed Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian population centers. That, to me, should be the Ukrainian message. We are continuing to get bombarded by the Russians, who continue to hit civilian targets, right, and continue to do what I think many would see as war crimes of systematically targeting civilian infrastructure. It seems to me that it would be better to shift the focus back to that, and of course the focus also on Ukraine's military successes and what that means for the continuation of the war and the continued Ukrainian campaign to try to get as many weapons as it can from countries around the world, from the rest, and of course from Israel as well.
Right. And as you mentioned, this is the first time that since the war broke out that the fighting is spilling over in Europe. How can we expect NATO and its allies to prepare for any further spillover?
I think the best that can be done is to try to plan and to play war games and strategize and try to prepare what exactly the response might be to different scenarios. One would imagine that this would have happened and been happening, Sarah, since February 24th, if not before, right? Since the day the war started, if not earlier. And one would imagine that there is a lot of contingency planning being done. And obviously no contingency planning is going to be complete because reality is always more complex. But it certainly is, one would imagine it's possible that the Russians either intentionally or unintentionally would launch weapons that would land in NATO of territory, and there has to be a decision about what to do. And obviously different allies and different countries are going to have different expectations. So it seems to me that the strategy planning and scenario planning is the best that can be done.